maybe more children, and maybe another marriage, and a move. Then the 4 hypothesized siblings born from 1826 to 1832 in Ohio: Elizabeth, Isaac, Sarah, and Mary. To compare and visualize the various relationships, by the way, you don't need to get out your magnifying glass. You're not intended to read everything on this. But to compare and visualize the various relationships and DNA matches, Carol put together a series of scaffold charts. This is an early version of the chart for Stephen, who is circled in green near the top, showing John as his possible father with the question marks, and then showing Stephen's known descendants based on traditional genealogical research. I wanted to show you this chart to give you an idea of how many people were tested over the course of this project. 15 of the descendants shown on this chart have tested, and the DNA match information is shown in each of their boxes: the number of centimorgans and the match of the match and to whom. Specifically on the bottom left in the red box is Marilee, one of our collaborators, along with 3 siblings and her mother, all of whom took DNA tests and show matches to Johnsons on other branches. In the center, in the red box, you see Carol, project instigator and collaborator, and her 2 nephews who show matches across Stephen's branches. But Carol also shows a match to me, and I'm descended from Sarah, not Stephen. And on the far right in a red box, you see Jenny in Alaska with her DNA connections to Marilyn, descended from Stephen's son, John Wesley, and to Carol, descended from Stephen's son, Nelson Oliver, and to me, descended from Sarah, Stephen's likely sister. For purposes of this presentation, to make it easier to follow, we pared the charts down to include just the top matches on each branch. By top matches, we mean the match closest to the source, although we included both Marilee and her mother, since Marilee was a key collaborator. Here's the chart showing Stephen's descendants with the top DNA matches circled in red. A couple interesting matches shown here that demonstrate the relationship between my second great-grandmother Sarah's line and presumed brother Stephen's line. Jenny Johnstone Betterton on the far right shows a 50 centimorgan match to me, an even higher match than my match to Carol at 43 centimorgans. Another indicator of the importance of testing multiple ancestors, especially older generations who are closer to the source. And Marilee's mother, Marilyn Johnson, on the far left, shows up as an 11 centimorgan match to my first cousin, Deb, descended from Sarah. One other item, I would like to note the passing of one of Stephen's descendants, Pauline Johnstone Whitcomb, the mother of Julie Whitcomb McGee, both shown on this chart. Pauline passed away on July 10th of this year, after this chart was created. Mm-hmm. Here we see Joshua's known descendants with matches to Carol, Jenny, and Marilyn on Stephen's line, and to me on Sarah's line. Likewise for John Webster, we see matches to Carol, Don, Jenny, and Scott on Stephen's lines, and to me on Sarah's line. For Elizabeth, we have 4 top matches who show matches with Marilyn and Jenny on Stephen's line and with me on Sarah's line. For my Sarah, I have relatively few relatives to test, but both my first cousin Deb and I, as well as my brother, showed matches to Stephen's line. And I also showed matches to John Webster's and Elizabeth's lines. So here's the big picture. Looking at the 6 hypothesized children of John Johnson, for whom we had genealogical data, we had about 30 DNA matches for descendants of 5 of the 6 presumed children of John Johnson that support our hypothesis. Isaac is the only one of the 6 for whom we have no DNA matches or descendants identified to be tested. yet. Coming back to one of my original questions, how am I related to Carol and Marilee? Here I've placed our descendancy charts side by side with Carol and Marilee's chart on the left and mine on the right, and sized them such that the generations more or less line up. Our presumed ancestor, John Johnson, is at the top with the question marks, and the green boxes in the next generation indicate our known ancestors and presumed siblings, Stephen Johnson and Sarah Johnson Barr. The next generation of descendants are first cousins, in other words, children of siblings. The next generation after that are children of first cousins or second cousins. And the next generation are third cousins, which brings us to Carol and me, outlined in red. We are both fourth generation descendants of presumed siblings, so we are fourth cousins. And John Johnson would be our third great-grandfather. Marilee, outlined in orange, is another generation removed from our sibling ancestors. So she is a fourth cousin once removed to Carol and me. And John Johnson would be her fourth great-grandfather. So we have a preponderance of evidence, but no proof. We have DNA evidence that connects descendants from 5 of the 6 hypothesized siblings, for whom we have genealogical data. Given that only half of fourth cousins share detectable DNA, we find this pretty compelling. We have not found direct evidence of our connections to John and Sarah Johnson, but we've found information that supports our theory of a familial relationship, including geographical location, proximity, and shared households. And we have not found any data that are inconsistent with our hypothesis. So the bottom line, our known ancestors were in the same place at the same time, and we have DNA cousin matches consistent with the genealogy. Which brings me to one of the highlights of this project, a family reunion over 150 years in the making. On June 17th, 2022, Marilee visited San Diego, and the 3 of us cousins were able to get together for lunch and data review. This may be the first time that descendants of Stephen and Sarah have been together since Pike County in the 1860s. And just a little Johnson family trivia. Although we share ancestral roots in Illinois and Ohio, and we now live in California, Carol and I also share a DC connection. We were both born in Washington, DC, just a few years apart. Both of our fathers were engineers, and both of our fathers worked for the Naval Research Lab at the time we were born. So, where are we now? Well, we certainly have additional questions. For instance, who was John Johnson's wife, Sarah, that we have listed in the 1850 census? A maiden name would really be nice. When and where did they marry? Did John have an earlier wife, or maybe 2? Were both the Johnsons and Barrs living in Claremont County, Ohio, before Pike County, Illinois? What was their connection? Given that young John was born in Claremont County, and that Joshua was married there and his wife Elizabeth was born there, it seems likely that the Barrs and Johnsons knew each other there. Maybe the reason I don't find any other Barrs moving to Pike County is that David went there on his own to join the Johnson family and marry Sarah. I'm romantic. So some possible next steps. Search for additional death, burial, and probate records. There are lots of those still to be found. Also, search for additional land records, especially for David Barr and the Johnson siblings, hypothesized siblings. In-person research in Pike County, Illinois, and Claremont County, Ohio. Find more matches to different and/or additional siblings. Maybe we can fill in some of those gaps between kids. And trace additional lines forward. For instance, David and Sarah's other children. I know of a couple of the lines that I can trace forward, but they don't have living children. So I need to work on the other lines. But here's our dream. Our dream is that we find a last will and testament for John Johnson that reads something like this. I, John Johnson of Pike County, Illinois, son of father's name and mother's maiden name of this place, being of sound mind, yada, 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 do hereby will and bequeath all my worldly possessions to my X number of children, to wit, list children's name with spouses, with married and maiden names, please, and wife of mother's maiden name for each. Current residence would have also been nice. So we can dream. And now the wrap up. Our research has relied on a combination of 21st century tools and traditional genealogy. The DNA matches were mostly from Ancestry DNA, but we also had a couple of matches who tested with family tree DNA. And we used several other sites for their tools. To establish provable relationships, we relied on traditional genealogical methods and records, including family trees, birth, marriage, and death records, census records, land records, and even school records, such as those for my great-grandfather and his sister, which were located in a small museum in Hale, Missouri, population 500. We also used family stories, letters, and diaries to provide facts, clues, and context. One tool we used to compile and visualize our results was an ancestry test tree for the hypothetical John Johnston family, a private tree, so our speculations would not be picked up as fact on other people's trees. Carol used MyHeritage clusters for some of her comparisons, and Marilee and I used spreadsheets for some of ours. And as I've shown, we developed timelines and scalpel charts for our cast of characters and used maps to familiarize ourselves with their relative locations, pun intended. So there are lots of benefits to this kind of collaboration. We each had different matches and connections to the Pike County Johnson family. We had different skill sets, such as for DNA comparison, scalpel, land records, PowerPoint, storytelling. We had different family research and connections, different family stories, different perspectives. And of course, by working together, we had more person hours for research. But the bonus was the personal connections we formed among living cousins. Some of our guiding principles: start with what you know. Everything in genealogy starts with what you know. For DNA testing, test oldest relatives first, since they are more likely to carry some DNA from distant ancestors. I'd also add that in addition to my mom, I tested my brother early on. He was younger than me, but in poor health, and actually died before my mother. Take another look at existing information. As you have more information, the information you have may yield more clues, as with the census records I had for the Barr family. Which brings us to fans, the friends, associates, and neighbors. With more information, those neighbors' surnames practically jumped off the page.